All right. So I'm Corey. I've been in IT security for 10 years. I started in risk assessment at EMC, RSA, and a financial institution. I was a security operations center analyst at Bloomberg for a couple of years, assistant security advisor at Dell SecureWorks. About 5 years ago, I did a master's program in cybersecurity, where my thesis was on expert knowledge, elicitation methods, and information security. Currently, I lead cybersecurity analytics and operations at NYU College of Dentistry. Today, I'll present a big problem in how most of us assess cybersecurity risk. Then I'll present how Bayesian networks may be an exciting solution. So as you can imagine, you can get a lot of data from computers. So there are questions we can do use Bayesian networks, machine learning, and other analytical instruments to answer. But as you can also imagine, individuals and organizations tend to be less forthcoming with data about how they got hacked or how much it cost. Hackers and malware are also quite apt at incentivized to erase data or prevent leaving their digital fingerprints, so to speak, in the first place. You might imagine cybersecurity data collection and efficacy is kind of like law enforcement data. With that as your baseline, consider the fact that most breaking and entering isn't reported when it comes to cybersecurity. Your company doesn't call the police for every malware infection, phishing scam, or port scan of your network like they would report traditional crime equivalents of someone deliberately sticking you with a dirty needle or being conned or observing a stranger checking if your doors and windows are locked. Also, in the case of cybersecurity, you have a much larger house to protect. And when your TV isn't on the wall anymore, you know it's been stolen. In the case of data, the criminal just takes copies and you don't notice the crime, so you don't report it. So what you end up with is a lot of non-representative data about your own institution and even less representative data about other institutions. Then what models you do create are quickly broken by new technologies. For example, there was a brief period of time when you could monitor your network for very large transfers of data to countries that your network had never talked to before. Now hackers just upload sensitive data to Box and Google Drive and Facebook, which makes the traffic indistinguishable from normal users. And there are changes like that happen much more frequently. So we have a lot of uncertainty, but we still need to make decisions. So how we do model our risk when the data isn't representative, even temporarily, varies between companies, but I encourage each of you to ask the people that are charged with protecting your data, how do you measure risk? Ask them to see specifically, how do they quantify it? Most likely you're going to get something like this slide, because this is what academic programs, industry certifications, and compliance mandates teach. It's a table with scary events on the left and scores on the right. These probability scores are then multiplied by the impact scores, yielding a risk score. The scores don't come from studies or special analyses. They come from usually one or two security or compliance people in the organization who just pick a number. And then using the majestic powers of Excel, the security or compliance analyst then sorts the risk column from the highest score to the lowest score, and recommends changes to your company starting from the top that will reduce the risk scores. So if you do, and the idea is what the security and compliance, if you do what the security and compliance people recommend to mitigate the risk, like mandate that people use firewalls and antivirus, we say you will have reduced risk from high to medium. But when the CFO asks how much is reasonable to spend on antivirus and firewalls, that is, how do we measure the distance between high and medium? That's one of life's greatest mysteries for most people in my profession, unfortunately. So there's a growing movement in favor of methods that use real math and actually improve decisions, unlike ordinal scoring and heat maps. And legitimate methods have been around for over 40 years. You'll find these in actuarial science, ecology, engineering, and finance. This crowd is not, deficient in that. You're very well aware of the very sophisticated ways to measure risk and deal with uncertainty. I maintain a risk assessment tool written in a statistical programming language called R. that is my intent to provide an open source and free option that adheres to the literature and remains accessible. But I believe the future of cybersecurity risk assessment isn't Bayesian networks, because although the tool works and it helps people put in real numbers like I'll show you, it's a spreadsheet-based tool. At the end of the day, it's a two-dimensional thing that does not connect well to automation and is very time-consuming, so ends up not being feasible. So the first thing we do is we start by moving away from the scores from experts with definitions like high risk or very high risk. And we instead ask our experts to provide actual numbers like, I can see this attack playing out on our servers maybe twice in 7 years or once every 2 years, some sort of frequency format. And then for characterizing the impact of scary events, that if this server were to get hacked, we're talking $1 million in losses, but due to breach fines and lawsuits, it could be as high as 6 million. So range estimates like these are critical because they allow our experts to express their uncertainty, and uncertainty can and should be included in our risk model. It's always something you can't do with high, medium, and low scores. If somebody really has no idea, they can say, I don't know. It's between 0 and $1 billion, with the most likely of, I don't know, right in between. Usually they talk down from that number. You give them an absurd range and they say, I have no idea. You say, is it 99 billion? And they say, no. And you talk down to, is it 1 million? No, it's less than that. 500,000, less than that. And you end up getting to a calibrated estimate and end up recording it so that other people can see it and scrutinize it. So CFO or management or somebody opposes it, they can get their word in too and say, I disagree with that. Here's why. And everything's out in the open. It's not locked up in a score that nobody can really argue with. So in practice, here are the risk scenarios on the left and the range estimates through subject matter experts on the right instead of scores. The problem now is that you can't directly multiply probability ranges and impact ranges with a calculator or Excel like you can do with scores, like 1, 2, and 3 times 1, 2, or 3, or high, medium, low. So I'm just showing these sheets as a kind of visual aid, introducing the concepts. This is not PERT, is how I'm using BayesiaLab. I'll show that in a couple slides. So more sophisticated analysts will try to address this problem of how do you multiply ranges together in the form of 3-point estimate. It'll be from 0 to 1 million with the most likely of 100,000, for example. So they'll use those 3-point estimates as the parameters in the distribution function. In Excel or BayesiaLab, you might use the normal distribution function or triangular or t-normal or log normal or power law, or whatever you think is appropriate. Ideally, whatever your observable data is saying, this is the distribution of these kinds of events. I prefer the modified PERT distribution described or modified by David Bose, because it has the ability to closely approximate these popular distributions and the flexibility to be everything in between while remaining the same computer formatted function with the same number of inputs. This means I don't need to change my code to make uniform or normal or log normal or power law for every estimate an expert provides or that available data suggests. It also means I don't have to add an alpha, beta, gamma, mean, standard deviation, etc. value just to accommodate a different distribution. I can do all those things and it's 4 inputs, 3 or 4 inputs. So this slide shows the output shape of the modified beta PERT. When you give it a probability estimate of 1 to 50% of a bad thing happening, with the most likely of 5%. That is alongside an impact estimate of $8,000 to $10 million, with the most likely of $10,000. Most experts who are best suited to provide these estimates don't have intuition for standard deviation or the probability of losing $8,000. So I can say, what's the probability of losing $8,000? And they saw, 5%. That's easy. That's never how it goes for me anyway. So these 3-point estimates are intuitive and transparent. The only thing I varied in this table is the peakedness variable or kurtosis. So the modified beta PERT accepts 4 inputs: your minimum, your maximum, your most likely, and your kurtosis. Yeah, that kurtosis is your distribution. Basically, your distribution peak is this. The lowest kurtosis value generates a uniform distribution. You can see the green line is flat. It has a kurtosis of 0.001. And the highest kurtosis would generate a triangular distribution. And then everything in between is just basically a softer edge on your distribution. And then if people, I know it's always weird when somebody talks about a distribution that's not in the math textbooks. If you want further reading, check out Bose software, where David describes his modification to it and the historical story behind Beta PERT and NASA, RAND, and other people using it and finding issues with it and then modifying it to solve those problems. So for more information, check that out. And he develops tools where you can just easily implement the distribution in Excel and other spreadsheet tools. I think he also has a software, but again, it's very spreadsheet based modeling. I don't think it has Bayesian network functionality yet, but maybe this will motivate it. So you can use Monte Carlo simulation or summary statistics to get a synthetic data set that represents not only the probability and impact of what you're considering, but also the amount of certainty you have with that distribution. So you can repeat the process and then you can repeat this whole process a second time of collecting those estimates. The second time factoring in security controls that you're proposing. So I think you have a firewall and antivirus and multi-factor authentication or something more sophisticated. And then a difference between the two synthetic data sets, one simulated with controls, one simulated without controls. That's the perceived risk reduction and the value of the control you're proposing. So how much is my security control really saving you on a year-to-year basis? It's not usually something you get an answer from when you ask a security person. How much is that firewall even saving us anyway? Because we're paying $1 million a year and we haven't had a breach yet or somebody hasn't tried to break in yet. So is it really saving us money? So instead of bogus heat maps, you can have pre-visualizations and statistical summaries that actually illustrate perceived risk. You can report estimated annualized savings, have a firewall, or maybe find the opposite. That's not good investment. You can also scrutinize the inputs and change them as you collect new data. People can audit your work, see your assumptions, and change them in the right place, whether it be in your probability estimate or your impact estimate. Okay, so this is a BayesiaLab conference, I suppose. So naturally, I wanted to do this in BayesiaLab, but Modified Beta PERT isn't a function. So we implemented Beta PERT as follows. Beta obviously is a function in the equation tab of any of your nodes. So I just use that. All Beta PERT really does is takes your minimum, maximum, most likely, and approximating alpha and beta that you can input into your beta distribution. You have a more intuitive way of controlling the curve of the distribution. So let's say you ask me what the potential impact of your research server is being hacked over the next 12 months. Then I say, well, on the low end, $8,000, because that's the minimum security investigation cost at this company. And even if no data is actually stolen, if somebody breaks in and they're just snooping around and they didn't actually get to anything, we're going to have to spend $8,000. So that's my low end. Then let's say the CFO puts the high end at $10 million, because that was what a similar institution paid after factoring in compliance fines and litigation expenses for being sued by research subjects for value because you looked at their data. You can put 10 million as your upper bound. Most likely the CFO and I may agree that although the values are probable, the sort of thing usually amounts to around $10,000. Then I'm making these numbers up. In this case, it's going to vary by industry. By company. And let's say we put that input here in this BayesiaLab and that can work. It's not exactly a Bayesian network at this point, but it's a network. Note that many of the nodes are not necessary here, but I have them there to illustrate more transparently what's going on. You can simplify this a great deal by encoding it all into an equation in BayesiaLab, fortunately, so that you can have a lot of these in a much more complex network. That's the impact estimate. This is the probability estimate. Same network, different inputs. How likely is this to happen in the next 12 months? It is possible that a breach will occur, so I'm going to put 1% as the minimum. If I told you I can see this happening every 2 years, that would be a 1 in 2 chance, which is 50%. It could be that, but it can't be sure. So I figure 50-50 is the worst case here, the upper bound. And I don't know what the probability is, but I think it is on the low end. So I'm going to put 5% for now as the most likely. And then maybe later on we learn about more information that changes that. And we put that in there, we record that as a rationale. We tick that up to 5% or down. You could have something in the case of when the US government sends out security alerts saying there's higher risk of certain types of attack or specific industries being targeted, you could raise that up temporarily. So at the very least now, you can multiply the mean of those two beta PERT sets together. And since your estimates for a 12-month period, this gives you what some call an expected loss or annualized loss expectancy. It isn't what you actually expect to lose next year, but it approximates the average cost of creations due to your research server over many years. So if you assess everything on the same scale, you can have this relative comparison tool. The average is dangerous to use in many cases, but in this case, it is a single value weighted by impact and probability values, as well as uncertainty in the form of how wide your ranges were, which is a world away from the high, medium, and low that we started with. And as you can see, the underlying assumptions are also explicit and everybody can scrutinize them. So at this point, you've satisfied major compliance and industry standard guidance like ISO and NIST and COBIT, et cetera, because you've made a probability estimate, an impact estimate, and derived a metric with which you can prioritize risk mitigation strategies. The scores were fine for compliance, but you've also started to use subjective risk measurement methods that actually use math and the guidance from decision-making psychology. They can now interface with fancy data science because you're actually creating real continuous data sets. So you can use data science, machine learning, Bayesian network, et cetera. So in order to make these subjective estimates part of a Bayesian network model, we can use the impact estimate distribution and probability distribution as the formula to fill a node probability table in the same way we use other equations in BayesiaLab. And that's what's shown between this, probability estimates on one side, impact estimate on the other. How do these come together to form my synthetic data set representing risk, otherwise your risk model? And so in this case, I simply multiplied the two together. The effective is a distribution where the dollar amounts from the impact distribution occur at a frequency prescribed by the probability side distribution. If you do a Monte Carlo simulation of the equivalent two data sets, the results are the same. Using the average, you do lose the distribution shape. But the nice thing about BayesiaLab is because we are also getting we're getting the discretized rough distribution shape, we can do things like, what's the 90th percentile? What's the probability of losing? If there's a 20% chance of losing $8,000 or more, there's a 100% chance of losing whatever. And you can make probabilistic statements like that. So just to get into a challenge that I have, and I know people are looking at this and they're like, why did you do it this way? I would love to hear your feedback. I'm totally amateur at all this. The problem I have at this point is discretization effects. To monitor that, I compare the expected mean to the inferred mean of the discretized set. In this case, a distribution of intervals of 50 ranging $0 to $10 million yields an error of about $14,000. This isn't very different from the jitter you get from a Monte Carlo simulation equivalent, so it's not that bad. I tried to create a junction tree that essentially does dynamic discretization based on KLD entropy to solve the problem, but that's a work in progress. And that basically just means the discretization buckets are not static. You can have, and it will change based on the inputs, and I don't have to change it manually. And that would reduce the discretization effects. And so you don't get weird things like, if I use this model exactly the same way it is right now, and I go back to the top and instead of 0 to 10 million, I put in 0 to, maybe I'm like, I want to know how much this coffee is going to cost. It's going to be between, or how much I pay for this coffee. It's between $0 and $10. But it's most likely $3. It's $3 is most likely what I'll pay the average of $0 to $10 is most likely, 3 is going to be like 5 million because of discrimination effects. So that's something I'm still dealing with. So in practice, knowing the risk is as important as knowing the risk before and after some proposed security risk mitigation strategy. So one could repeat estimates after qualitatively factoring in the various mitigation strategies and record the model outputs on paper or in a separate sheet or as an output of the program. Alternatively, you could copy the model and just change the copy's value given the controls you're factoring in. In this case, on the left, you have the current states, and on the right, you have the state of the risk if you go with the security control recommendation, whether that be firewall, antivirus, multi-factor, etc. All I changed in this case is I lowered the probability estimate from having an upper bound of 50-50 to an upper bound of 25%. To basically saying, given that you have firewall, antivirus, and multi-factor authentication. So this is between the before and after state, and it's an approximation of the difference in risk. In this case, we're seeing how much the set of security controls is believed to be saving us after factoring in probability, perceived impact, and the uncertainty we have. There costs more than $250,000 a year for your firewall, antivirus, and multi-factor authentication. So you should consider something cheaper. Unless, of course, your server is part of a larger institution who has those things paid at the enterprise level, in which case you want to ensure the sliver of your budget that goes into your enterprise security doesn't exceed that amount. Otherwise, you're going to spend more short and long term on the security control than the actual losses that you're trying to prevent. So at this point, it's experimenting with connecting. So at this point, I don't think it qualifies as a Bayesian network at this stage. So I'm really experimenting with different Bayesian networks and where they can connect, whether they be learned or manual. So you can have had vulnerability scan data, and how does that fit into this? I can take in my subjective baseline and then have my vulnerability scan update those values. If you notice, I generated an NPT for each of these calculations. I did so because I believe these are the great interface points for more sophisticated use of Bayesian networks. And this is where you can integrate your baseline, refine subject matter experts estimates with whatever extra data or models you have or end up acquiring. So you can also start introducing your controls at the top level. You're not limited, obviously, to using that discretized set. You can connect BayesiaLab to your database and get live telemetry from your systems, meaning like your firewall system, your monitoring systems in general, or you could have the firewall flipped to false if your distance telemetry says, hey, if the firewall on these 6 computers or servers or whatever, just stop the service. Then you could have a switch causing the overall risk to spike in those. And that might set off an alert to your security operations center or your management. Or if you had 2 servers in a network, reported virus detection, probability on a subnet network of your institution, the probability of all the other servers in the subnet could go up because the nature of the virus is that it's going to spread, or it's trying to. So with that kind of real-time integration, you could set meaningful prioritization of your security tickets for your security operations center on an hour-to-hour basis. And analysts could investigate the server with the highest risk in terms of, because right now when security analysts and even like major security products, they don't do anything really that sophisticated. They just score. They just say, this is pretty bad, so we're going to raise up that arbitrary number by 1,000 points. And this other thing isn't so bad, so it's only 100 points. And it's not really about probability impact. It's just like badness in general without context. So at least this way, you're prioritizing based on the probability of the loss event in mind behind a risk, the impact of the loss event. And if you're uncertain, you're actually programming that uncertainty into it. And the uncertainty is having the effect of increasing the cost, which is a little strange, but it is a way to basically honor the fact that you have uncertainty and not pretend that you don't and try to just make some dangerous assumptions. So one other common control that you might put in here is a data control, meaning it can, instead of a firewall or multi-factor authentication or antivirus, it's something that reduces uncertainty. If we establish sensors in these parts of the network, or if we collect this data or we buy this data set and do an analysis, we can reduce our uncertainty. We can reduce that crazy range of 0 to 10 million to 0 to 800,000. And so the value of that data is the difference between what your old range was and what your new range is. So you can help justify expenses that are purely informational. Through just other use cases, if you introduce dynamic Bayesian networks with temporal nodes, you can have risk declines as time progresses, which can help you with to drive project prioritization. Very common in security to talk about, we really need to do this because ransomware is really exciting and happening. And then you don't get the support, and then time goes by and other projects take priority and people aren't seeing ransomware in the news anymore. And the risk is still there. It's just not cool anymore. It's just not in the news. So you can have something that risk decreases just because time is passing. The opportunities to attack are still there, and the probability of this happening is increasing. You can also export all of the great Bayesian diagnostic residuals, including sensitivity analyses. So for sensitivity analysis, it would be critical to use them to identify estimates that drive the model so much that you might want to consider paying for that expense data or pool of experts to provide estimate. If you have something particularly contentious, when people pointing at that node and saying, that's an absurd estimate, I don't believe that, or that node happens to drive the whole network and dwarf the effects of every other node, that's where you should be focusing spending your money and coming up with a more refined products. Right. So that is all I have. This is where I'm at. I'm trying to connect new things and trying to connect the two worlds of compliance security, which involves these kind of subjective estimates and this requirement. Like no matter what, we have to do risk assessments, even if they're hokey using scores, unfortunately. So what I'm trying to do is bridge those two worlds and say, look, I'm doing the subjective estimates, but also say, I have all these other data sources and I can connect them and they can work together and then even automate those things. Thank you.